Okay, so today we're diving into something, well, it's a question, really. How do we actually tell the difference between, real science and pseudoscience?
It's a question that, keeps paying back, right? And it has all these real-world implications, too.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just an academic debate. I mean, think about it. It impacts, like, everything. Climate policies, healthcare decisions, what gets taught in schools.
Yeah. It gets to the core of how we know what we know, the justification for our beliefs.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on science and pseudoscience.
It's a pretty thorough overview.
Uh,
Lots to unpack there.
Yeah, lots to unpack. So we're here to kind of pull out the most important bits, especially for, well, someone like you interested in philosophy, nature of knowledge, all of that.
Right. And so the first thing that the encyclopedia brings up is why even bother? Why try to draw this line between science and pseudoscience?
Well, I think from a purely theoretical standpoint, it helps us understand, like, what is rational argumentation? It's
Mhm.
like, you know, studying fallacies and logic. It's sharpening our tools for critical thinking.
Yeah, it gets into the nitty-gritty of how we justify knowledge claims, like what makes an argument a good argument, especially in science.
Right, right. But then there's the practical side of things.
Mhm.
And that's where this issue gets really, well, real.
Oh, absolutely.
The encyclopedia uses climate policy as an example. Like, we have all this scientific evidence about climate change, human-caused climate change. But then you have, well, what they call science denial.
Which is a whole other can of worms, right?
Yeah. And it has consequences. The encyclopedia mentions, like, research by Cook and others, Powell or Reskies and Conway, Lewandowski, all these studies showing how misinformation can delay action on climate change.
And it's not just climate change. Think about environmental policies in general. We need to be able to tell the difference between real evidence of environmental hazards and, well, unfounded claims.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same with healthcare. I mean,
Yeah.
so much of modern medicine depends on, rigorous science. But then there's all this, what do you call it, medical pseudoscience,
Yeah.
treatments that haven't been proven effective or even worse, could be harmful.
It's a huge issue.
And the encyclopedia even talks about how this plays out in court cases. Like, you need expert testimony, right? But that testimony needs to be based on solid science.
Exactly. There's this philosopher, Pennock, who's actually been involved in cases like this, defending science against pseudoscience in the courtroom.
Wow. And then think about education. What gets taught in schools.
Yeah.
The encyclopedia specifically mentions creationism, attempts to teach it as science.
Right.
So having clear criteria for what is science is crucial there, right?
Absolutely. It's about teaching kids how to think critically, how to evaluate information for themselves.
Exactly. And even journalism, right? Like, the media plays a huge role in shaping public understanding of science.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia, it cites Boykoff and Boykoff here, their research on how the media can sometimes present pseudoscientific claims as, like, on par with real science.
Yeah.
And that can really distort public perception.
And it's not a new problem either. This whole idea of trying to define science, it goes way back. The encyclopedia mentions Aristotle, Cicero, ancient philosophers.
No.
They were grappling with similar questions, even if they didn't use the term pseudoscience specifically.
Right, right. But it seems like in the 20th century, that's when this idea of, like, contrasting science with pseudoscience really took off.
Yeah. And there was this philosopher, Laudon, who actually, like, declared the demarcation problem dead in the 80s. Yeah, he wrote this kind of provocative piece called The Demise of the Demarcation Problem, basically saying that it's a futile effort to try to find some kind of, universal criteria for what makes something science.
Interesting.
But as the encyclopedia points out, the issue hasn't gone away. Lots of philosophers today are still working on it. They might not be looking for a single, silver bullet definition, but they're still trying to clarify the concepts to understand, like, what are the key features that distinguish science from pseudoscience.
So the why is clear, but what about the words themselves, right?
Yeah.
What do we actually mean by science and pseudo in this context?
Well, the term pseudoscience, it actually goes back pretty far. The encyclopedia mentions a Latin term, pseudoscientia, appearing in the 17th century. And the English word, it pops up in 1796 in a discussion about alchemy.
Alchemy.
Yeah. And one thing that's been consistent throughout its history is that it's a negative term.
Right. Like, No one's proudly calling themselves a pseudoscientist.
Exactly. It's like saying something is bad science. It's a value judgment.
Right. And the encyclopedia makes a point that I think is important for, for a philosopher. Like, given that it's inherently a value judgment, maybe it's not even possible to have a completely neutral, objective definition.
Right. And that ties into how we think about science itself. It's not just a descriptive term, it's not just about what methods people use or what they study. It also implies like a certain goodness. Like science is supposed to be good at giving us knowledge.
Hmm. It has a positive role in how we try to understand the world.
Yeah.
But what we consider to be science is also influenced by history, by how different fields have developed over time.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting, the encyclopedia mentions this difference between the English word science and the German word Wissenschaft.
Hmm.
Wissenschaft is broader. It includes, like, the humanities.
Yeah. And they actually argue that this broader sense might be more useful when we're talking about this conflict between science and pseudoscience.
Interesting. Because it's not just about, disagreements within the natural sciences.
Right.
It's a broader conflict between, like, this whole community of knowledge disciplines, natural sciences, social sciences,
Yeah.
humanities, and these movements that contradict their generally accepted findings.
Yeah. It's like creationism, astrology, homeopathy.
Right.
They're not just disagreeing with like one specific experiment or something. They're challenging the whole way that we go about producing knowledge.
So at its core, it's about figuring out which beliefs are warranted, which beliefs have the best support.
Exactly. And the encyclopedia talks about fact-finding practices. Science is one of those practices,
Right.
But so is journalism, criminal investigation, even traditional knowledge systems.
So it's like a specific example of a more general problem. Like, how do we distinguish reliable fact-finding from, the less reliable kind?
Okay, so we've got a handle on science, but now what about pseudo? What makes something pseudo?
Well, the encyclopedia points out that, not everything that isn't science is pseudoscience.
Like there's art, metaphysics, ethics. These are all non-scientific, but they're not pretending to be science.
Right. And even within science, you have what they call bad science.
Yeah.
Like honest mistakes,
Yeah.
But pseudoscience is more specific than just unscientific.
Yeah, it's a different beast.
So what is it about pseudo? Well, it means false,
Right.
Counterfeit. And the Oxford English Dictionary, they define pseudoscience as a pretended or spurious science, mistakenly regarded as being based on scientific method.
It's about mimicry.
Yeah.
Trying to look like the real deal.
Exactly. And the encyclopedia, they pull out two key characteristics that a lot of people agree on. First, the belief system or whatever, it's not actually scientific.
Right.
And second, the people who are promoting it, they're trying to make it seem scientific.
Yeah.
Like they might create their own conferences, journals, organizations. They want to give it that air of legitimacy. Exactly. And there are even like specific terms for this. The encyclopedia mentions facsimile science and cultural mimicry of science.
So it's not just about like one person making a mistake. It's about a whole doctrine, a whole set of beliefs that goes against what's generally accepted by scientists.
Right. It's deliberate and it's organized.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia uses this example involving biochemists to illustrate this point. Like, if a scientist commits fraud, that's not usually called pseudoscience.
Right.
Because they're usually trying to make their fake results fit into existing theories.
They want it to blend in.
Yeah. But pseudoscience, it's pushing a different agenda altogether. It's trying to overturn established science.
And they talk about different senses of science, too. Like, pseudoscience isn't usually claiming to replace all of science, right?
Right.
It's usually targeting specific fields like biology or physics.
Right. So it's like a specific alternative, not a wholesale replacement.
Yeah. So the encyclopedia refines the definition a bit. They say pseudoscience is part of a non-scientific doctrine whose proponents are trying to create a scientific impression.
Okay.
But then it gets even more nuanced because sometimes pseudoscience is used more broadly. Like for any doctrine that goes against established science, even if they don't say they are science.
So it's not just about mimicking science. It's about like claiming to have the best, most reliable information, even if you're not pretending to be a scientist.
Exactly. It's about challenging the authority of science. And the encyclopedia points out this potential inconsistency in how some critics of pseudoscience use the term.
Right.
Like they might define it narrowly as something that pretends to be science, but then they'll use it more broadly for anything that contradicts scientific knowledge.
It's a bit slippery.
Yeah. And they give some examples to illustrate this involving creationism and DNA.
Okay.
Like, imagine a creationist text that accurately describes DNA structure. That wouldn't be pseudoscience just based on that content alone.
Right.
Or a chemistry textbook that makes a mistake about DNA. That's not pseudoscience either.
Right.
But a creationist text that denies common ancestry, that would be pseudoscience.
Right. Because it's going against the scientific consensus.
Exactly. And it often tries to present itself as a scientific alternative. And then you have a religious leader who just rejects the whole idea of scientific inquiry.
Right.
They might also reject common ancestry, but they're not pretending to be doing science.
So it's a different kind of challenge to science.
Yeah. And it shows how tricky it can be to apply this label.
So we've talked about why we're trying to make this distinction and what the terms mean.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, what are we actually trying to demarcate? What are the objects of demarcation?
Yeah, that's a key question.
Mm.
And the encyclopedia, they lay out a bunch of different proposals from, big names in philosophy of science. Licados, he talks about research programs. Bunge and Mahner focus on epistemic fields. Popper, he's all about theories. Lugg and Morris, they look at practices. Saitonin, problems, and then Kuhn and Mayo, they focus on inquiry itself.
Wow, like a lot of options.
Yeah, and it shows that demarcation can happen at different levels. You can zoom in on a specific theory, or you can zoom out and look at a whole research program, or even a whole field.
It's like different levels of analysis. Like you could study a cell or a tissue or a whole organ.
Yeah, exactly. And there are also different emphases. Like Dirksen, he argues that it's all about the pseudoscientists themselves, their intentions matter. But then Settle, he comes back and says, no, it's about the community. It's about how knowledge gets validated within a community.
So it's not just about individual beliefs. It's about the social structures of science.
Right. And those structures, they're not static either. The encyclopedia talks about this idea of a timeless demarcation. Yeah. And they say it's a misconception. Science is always changing, right? It's always progressing.
Yeah.
So any attempt to draw a line between science and pseudoscience has to be sensitive to that. What might be considered pseudoscience today might not be pseudoscience tomorrow.
Right. Because our understanding changes.
Exactly. And science is also super diverse. There are so many different fields, different methods, and even within a field, there's always room for revision.
So it's a moving target.
Yeah. And that makes it even harder to define.
Okay, so given all that, what are the actual criteria? What makes a claim pseudoscientific?
Well, the encyclopedia goes through a bunch of different options.
Okay.
One idea is to define it as anything that goes against the best knowledge we have right now.
Makes sense.
It's a pretty broad criterion, which is good, and it allows for, changes over time. But the problem is, how do you know what the best knowledge is? That often requires specialized knowledge. And then there are the historical attempts to define science, like the logical positivists back in the early 20th century.
Okay.
They were all about verificationism. A statement is only scientifically meaningful if it can be empirically verified.
So you have to be able to test it.
Yeah. But their main goal was to distinguish science from metaphysics, not pseudoscience specifically.
Right. And then there's Popper with his famous falsificationism.
Right. He said that a scientific theory has to be falsifiable. There has to be some possible observation that could prove it wrong.
Okay.
He was trying to draw a line between science and both pseudoscience and metaphysics.
Right.
But the problem is there are some legitimate scientific theories that are really hard to falsify definitively. And then on the other hand, there are some pseudoscientific claims that have been tested and refuted.
Oh, like astrology.
Yeah, exactly. So Popper's criterion, it doesn't quite work perfectly. And even Popper himself, he later revised his views a bit. He emphasized this idea of logical falsifiability.
Logical falsifiability.
Yeah, a statement is scientifically empirical if it logically contradicts some possible observation. But even that has its problems. The encyclopedia mentions how Popper changed his mind about Darwinian natural selection.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he initially thought it was a metaphysical research program, but then he later retracted that view.
Wow. So even he struggled with his own criteria.
Yeah.
And then you have Kuhn. Right.
Yeah, he came at it from a different angle. He was more focused on on normal science, the everyday work that scientists do within a shared paradigm.
Yep.
He said that science is distinguished by its ability to solve puzzles within that paradigm. And he contrasted that with astrology, where like contradictory evidence doesn't really lead to big changes in the theory.
So it's about how a community responds to challenges or inconsistencies.
Right. And Popper, of course, he disagreed with Kuhn's emphasis on normal science. He
Hmm.
said that astrologers also solve puzzles just within their own, weird framework.
Right. So it became this debate about whether the criteria for science should be like purely logical or more sociological,
Yeah.
based on the practices of a community.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have a bunch of other thinkers who focus on the idea of scientific progress. Lakatos, Thagard, Rothbart, Reich, Hoyning and Huene,
Oh,
Reskies.
okay. A lot of names.
Yeah, and they all have slightly different takes on it. Lakatos, he talked about progressive and degenerating research programs.
Right. Like whether a theory leads to new predictions that are confirmed or whether it's just like explaining things we already know.
Yeah, and Thagard, he brought in the social aspect. Like, a theory is pseudoscientific if it doesn't progress, and if the people who believe it don't try to develop it or compare it with other theories.
So it's not just about the theory itself. It's about how the community treats it.
Yeah. And then you have Rothbart with his testworthiness criterion, Reich emphasizing integration with other sciences, Hoyning and Huene focusing on systematic knowledge, Oresky's pointing out that even some pseudosciences can be systematic.
So lots of different angles here.
Yeah. And the encyclopedia also mentions this sociologist, Merton. He talked about the ethos of science, like the norms that scientists are supposed to follow.
Okay.
Universalism, disinterestedness, organized skepticism.
Mm.
And even though his work is more sociological, the encyclopedia suggests that it might have some useful insights for the demarcation problem.
Okay. And then finally, you have these multi-criterial approaches.
Yeah. Basically, people making lists of like characteristics that pseudoscience often has.
So like red flags.
Yeah, like reliance on authority, experiments that can't be replicated, cherry-picking data, refusing to test your claims, making up ad hoc explanations, abandoning explanations without replacing them.
So it's not just one thing. It's a whole pattern of problematic behavior.
Right. And this idea makes sense because science is complicated. Pseudoscience can deviate from it in all sorts of ways.
So it's like a family resemblance. There's no one defining feature, but there
Mhm.
are like these overlapping similarities.
Exactly. And all of this shows that like this demarcation problem, it's not a solved issue.
Right. There's no easy answer.
And the encyclopedia then goes on to talk about two faces of pseudoscience.
Two faces.
Yeah, they call them pseudo-theory promotion and science denialism.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
So pseudo-theory promotion is about trying to get people to accept a specific theory.
Like homeopathy.
Yeah, homeopathy, astrology, ancient astronauts, things like that.
Okay.
But science denialism is about rejecting a theory or a whole field.
So it's more about tearing down than building up.
Yeah, and there are lots of examples of this. Holocaust denial, climate change denial, denial of the link between tobacco and disease, HIV denialism, vaccination denialism.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of examples. And it seems like denialism has become a more common term in recent years, especially with climate change.
Yeah, you're right. And the term itself, it actually comes from Holocaust denial. And the key difference between these two faces is their attitude towards conflicts with established science. Like science denialists, they'll often create these fake controversies.
Right, trying to make it seem like there's like genuine debate within the scientific community.
Exactly. They did this with relativity theory back in the 30s, and the tobacco industry did it for years with the link between smoking and cancer. And now you see it all the time with climate change.
Right. But pseudo-theory promotion, it doesn't usually do that.
Yeah.
They'll often try to say that their ideas are like compatible with mainstream science.
Yeah, or even that mainstream science supports their ideas.
Right. And of course, there are some movements that kind of combine both.
Yeah, creationism is a good example.
Right. They have their own theory, but they also spend a lot of energy attacking evolution.
Exactly.
And the encyclopedia says that, these days, creationism functions mainly as a form of science denialism. Okay, so we've talked about pseudoscience and its two faces. But the encyclopedia also mentions these related concepts that can, like, muddy the waters a bit,
Yeah,
like skepticism.
right.
It has all these different meanings. There's philosophical skepticism, doubting everything. Then there's scientific skepticism, which is about being critical of evidence, including pseudoscience. And then there's science denialism, which is just rejecting the consensus outright.
It's important to keep those straight. And sometimes people even use the term pseudo-skepticism to describe, like, climate change denial.
Mm, yeah. So it's about being skeptical of the wrong things.
Yeah. And then there's just, like, resistance to facts in general.
Right. Not wanting to accept what's true, even if it's not about science specifically.
Exactly. And conspiracy theories are another big one. They often go hand in hand with pseudoscience.
Yeah, like trying to explain why the truth is being suppressed.
Right. And conspiracy theories have their own, like, weird logic. They're often very resistant to evidence, and they tend to go in circles.
And then there's bullshit.
Right.
Like just not caring about truth at all. And the encyclopedia argues that pseudoscience can be seen as a kind of like epistemic negligence, like a failure to be careful about what you believe.
Yeah, it's about a lack of intellectual responsibility,
Right. And finally, there's this idea of epistemic relativism.
which can be a real headache for this whole discussion.
Right.
Because if you think that there's no, like, objective truth, then how can you say that science is better than pseudoscience?
Yeah.
And some relativists have actually promoted denialist views, but the encyclopedia points out that not all relativists go that route. Some of them argue that, even if science is a social construct, it's still a pretty good one.
So it's not a simple issue. But after going through all of this, all these different perspectives, all these different criteria, the encyclopedia ends with this interesting observation.
What's that?
They call it a unity in diversity. Like, even though philosophers disagree about the exact definition of science and pseudoscience, they tend to agree on specific cases.
So everyone agrees that, like, creationism is pseudoscience.
Yeah, creationism, astrology, homeopathy.
Hmm.
It's like there's this shared understanding of what's wrong, even if we can't articulate exactly why.
And that's a pretty interesting philosophical puzzle, right? Like, how can we have this agreement on specifics without agreement on the general principles?
Yeah, and the encyclopedia suggests that this is an area where more philosophical work needs to be done.
Absolutely. And they also mention other related philosophical problems that are worth thinking about more,
Oh, like what?
like the relationship between science and religion, science and everyday knowledge, how we simplify science for education, methodological naturalism, the supernatural.
Yeah, a lot of big questions there.
So, we haven't solved the demarcation problem. It's still a complex and fascinating issue.
But hopefully, this deep dive has given you, a better understanding of the complexities involved, and maybe it's given you some new tools for thinking critically about the knowledge claims you encounter in the world.
Absolutely.
And for you, our philosophically minded listener, here's a final thought.
Okay, I'm listening.
Given this unity and diversity that we've talked about, what does it tell us about how we know things? Like if we can agree that something is pseudoscience, even without having a perfect definition, does that mean there's some kind of like intuitive understanding of what makes knowledge reliable?
That's a really good question. And it's something for all of us to ponder, like, what are the mechanisms behind this consensus? What does it tell us about the social and cognitive aspects of knowledge validation?
Yeah, it's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.